Hello, this is John Adams, and this is part 3 of my Introduction to Adobe Photoshop for Beginners. In this tutorial, we will discuss how to analyze the lighting and shadows in your images and make revisions and corrections to them. Now we'll go ahead and go back to our rubber ducky that we pasted onto the water background. One of the things that we need to consider when you're working with layers is that you can name layers. So the only layer that you can't change is the background layer, but I'll show you how you can change that if you want to rename it. Right now we're just going to leave it as background and keep it locked. But for our rubber ducky, I'm going to call this ducky 1 because we're going to add additional duckies to this, and then you can just click back on here. You can name each layer. You can also right click on them and create a color highlight for the specific area to show you that highlighting in the very beginning and to kind of color code what you're doing, but you don't necessarily have to do that if you don't want to. So we're going to talk about the first thing after we've pasted our object in here. The first thing that we need to really talk about is lighting and shadows. So as we look at the water background on this photograph for the water, we look at it and we see there's lighting on it, but we can't really tell exactly where the lighting's coming from. We're assuming that it's coming from above, but that's all we can tell. There's no shadows, so we can't really tell exactly, but we can tell by the color of this that it's a typical middle of the day, somewhere between possibly 11 o'clock and 3 o'clock, probably the middle of the day, closer to 11 to 2, because of the color of the water itself. But there's no highlights or shadows in the water except for the actual reflections of the water, so you can't really tell where it's coming from. The other thing we need to look at is on the rubber ducky is we have to look at the lighting on that. Now if we look at this, we see that there's a shadow underneath his head and underneath his bill. So we're assuming, and the highlight is right about here, here, and over in here. So we're assuming that the lighting's coming directly from in front, a little bit in front, not directly above, but partially above. So we can make modifications to this slightly, and there's quite a few different ways of doing this, but we'll discuss one of the different ways to work with this. So one of the ways to deal with the highlights and shadows on your rubber ducky is to go over to the Tools palette, and I'll scoot this up just a little bit so you can see what we're doing. But in the Tools palette over on the left hand side, you'll see that we have the Dodge tool. That's the one that looks like a little push pin basically, and underneath that, if you click on it, you'll see that there's a Dodge tool, there's a Burn tool, and there's a Sponge tool. So the Dodge tool is the one that's going to lighten areas, and the Burn tool is going to darken it. Even though you would assume that burning would make it lighter, that goes back to the photographic processing that actually used Burn and Dodge as their techniques for adjusting your images back in the day when Ansel Adams was creating his beautiful landscape images of Yosemite. So we're going to use the Dodge tool on this, and you'll see with the Dodge tool I have it set up at the top here in the options. It's set to midtone, so I'm going to go ahead and set it to highlights because we're going to work with highlights. So if I draw on here or brush, you can see that it gets lighter on the top, and the more you do it, the lighter it'll get. So if you lighten these areas, you can see it more if I go like this. I'm going to undo that part, but you can lighten certain specific areas more than others. So if you want it to look more like it is the sun is shining down on the rubber ducky, it would be better to lighten these areas in here a little bit more, and then you could possibly darken these areas if you need to, especially down here below the ducky, because one of the things, if it's sitting in the water, it's going to be a lot darker than this too. So we can go up here and we can change this from highlights to midtones, and it won't affect it because of the fact that there aren't very many shadows in here, and we're not creating shadows, we're actually working with highlights. You can also lower the exposure. Instead of at 50%, you can lower this down and it'll be a little bit lighter on here, you can see, and we'll lower it even more and you can see that. Okay, so that looks pretty good, not great. So I'm just gonna go ahead and lighten these areas a little bit here, maybe a little bit on the duck's bill, and I think that's about as good as we can get on that area. So you can affect it a little bit that way. So now we'll go to, instead of the dodge tool, we'll go to the burn tool, and in the burn tool you want to affect the shadows on here. So we'll go to shadows, we'll lower this exposure down too because we don't want to affect it too strongly. And you can go in here and let's see if we can increase this up to where it was, if we can get it darker in here, and you can see a little bit darker below. Let's try, because we're going to work on the highlight areas, let's try this. Okay, that works a little bit better in the highlight areas, and you can see how it's getting a little darker. And of course it's not going to be perfect because of the fact that it doesn't create too much of a color itself. And I'm going to go ahead and lower this percentage down a little bit more, and then just really lightly adjust the darkness on here and get it like that. So that looks pretty good. That doesn't look bad at all. So the only thing is it doesn't have the color reflection of the actual yellow orange that we would have on a object like this. So anytime you see light reflection on an object, it not only reflects the light, but it reflects the reflection of the actual object itself. So a lot of times you'll get more of a warmer color to this. So we could add a specific another layer on top of this and create a new layer that we can actually paint color in here. So one way of doing this would be creating a new layer. So down here in the layers palette next to the trash can is create a new layer. So if I create a new layer right now, it's creating a layer on top of the layer that we're working on. And on this layer, if we go to use the paint tool, we can select the paint tool, and also below the paint tool there's pencil, there's color replacement tool, and a mixer tool. We just want to use the paint tool. So with the paint tool you need to pick color. So down in the actual bottom here of the toolbox, you'll see that there is a foreground color and a background color. So if you click on the foreground color, your dialog box will come up to show the foreground color. So you can pick a specific color. Or, you know, if we went in here, we can try to pick the right color, but that's not going to be very accurate. So if you move your cursor over the actual rubber ducky, you can pick that shadowy area if you want to. And I'm going to pick a little bit lighter shadow in here, like in this area, and you can see what it actually what color this is. So if you pick that color, that's great. We'll just go ahead and say okay. It shows up in your foreground color here, and that's what you'll be painting with. The only problem that you will run into if you start painting now is you're going to get this really terrible looking color that's very super strong, and it's not going to look quite right. So there's a couple things we can do to this. The first thing that I like to do is lower the opacity up here in the options. Lower it way down to about 11, 12, 15%. Then you can actually go in here and paint in some shadows. And you can see it's very, very subtle. It's not very strong, but it's enough to make a difference that you can see we have a little bit stronger shadow down here now. And it looks a little bit more realistic. And down here, the very bottom of the ducky. Now, the other thing you can do too is change the size of your brush. Now, at first, the size of the brush is really great, but there's times when you may want to make it bigger. So you can just go ahead and right click on your canvas that you're working on, and your dialog box comes up. Now the first thing you need to know about the paintbrush is that there's a soft edge and a hard edge, and there's other brushes too, but these are the two main types of brushes that we use. The soft edge is the one that's really nice and soft. The hard edge is not very soft at all, and I'm going to lower the size of this so you can see it. But you can see it's got a hard edge on it. It doesn't look very good. I'm also using the Command Z control, or you can use Control Z on a Windows. Control Z is the undo command. It will undo what you've already done. So if you've created something like that, you can go ahead and undo it. You can go back. It looks like you can only do it once, but you can do it multiple times, and then after you've done it once, it'll say redo, so it'll go back and forth and toggle. If you hold your Command Option key down, and I'm not sure what that is, it would be Control Option, I think, on Windows, that it will go back multiple steps as you do that. So you can see I can go back multiple times, and it's going back to the brush that I had done previously. So that is how we want to add some shadow to it if you want to use color. But you can see the huge difference on here when we add the color by just turning on and off your layer, and that's by clicking on the little eye here. So that's one way of doing that. You could also paint in a lighter area on the rubber ducky, but I think it looks pretty good right now. And we could exaggerate that a little bit more where it's sitting in the water, and we'll go ahead and do that. Now I can pick a little bit darker color too. So if I go into my foreground color again, I can pick a little bit darker color just by scooting down slightly. And you can see as I paint in here, I'm painting. Now the only other thing that is a problem is when I'm painting in here, you can see that there's excess around the edge. Now what I should have done before I did this painting procedure that I'm showing on here, and we'll redo it again, and I'll show you a better way of doing this. So you can see if I turn this off, you can't really see it that great, but if I had a white background, you can see some of the yellow in here. When I'm painting this in, you can see it's a lot darker, and then it's showing up on the water. So you really don't want to do that. So I will show you another way of handling this. So if you don't want the layer that you're working on, if it's all by itself, you can just click and drag it down to the trash, or you can right click it on it and delete the layer too. I like just dragging it to the trash. It's easier and quicker, because if you go the other route by deleting the layer, it gives you this dialog box and you have to answer all the time. So I don't like having to answer, so it just makes it a lot faster if you do it the other way. So let's create another layer on here. And on this layer, let's go ahead, before we go ahead and do this, let's get rid of this. I'll show you one more time here. Okay, so in order to get back to the selection of the rubber ducky, I want to actually use that to paint into, so I don't go over the edges and over into the blue area. So if you hold your Command key down, you'll see that you have a little square. It looks like a marching ant. Now that should work on a Windows with Command or with your Control key. So click once and you'll go back to the original selection that you created for the rubber duck. And then when we create our new layer, we'll create a new layer. It doesn't do anything, it just keeps that selection. The selections can be used on any layer. So if I go to this layer now and I use the paintbrush and I use the brown color, now let's pick this color again. We'll go back and we'll pick a little bit lighter, or maybe a little darker. There we go. Pick that color again, and then we'll go ahead and add some color in here, darker shades. And you can see in here, it's coming up. And one of the things that I didn't do, I didn't switch back to soft edge brush. So you have to make sure that you do that, otherwise you get these really hard edge lines in here, and you can see that on here. So, and also if you want to increase the size of your brush, if you right click, you can increase it this way. And what I was going to tell you is you can increase it. There's another way of doing this. There's a keyboard shortcut for this that works really good, and that's using the right bracket makes it bigger, and the left bracket on your keyboard makes it smaller. So I'm going to make it a little larger, and then I'm going to paint this in a little bit more, and I think I'm going to pick a darker color here shortly. I'm going to go ahead and add this here on the rubber ducky. Now what happens, even if I picked another color like black when I'm painting, you can see what happens is if I draw across here like this, and I had that at full strength, I'm going to undo that. Up here in the options, opacity, I have it way down, but if I brought that all the way up to 100, if I draw in here, you can see that I can't affect the water background because it's being restricted by that selection area. So I'm going to undo this, Command Z or Control Z on Windows, and then I'll go back to my color selection on here, and I'll pick a little bit darker color. I'll say OK, and we'll darken this. Now I forgot to set the opacity down, and that's why I set the opacity down. This one will have a little bit lighter or darker or heavier percentage, more of a percentage on here. We want it a little bit darker, and then I'll lower it down slightly and just get this edge so it doesn't look so extreme. And this. Okay, so that looks pretty good, I think. And then we're going to do the little lip here, and there we go. And it's starting to look a little bit better. So that gives you an idea of what you can do. You can still go in here if you want to erase. You can use your eraser tool, which is right here. You can go in here and erase too, but you can see what that does also. It's very strong. You can go ahead and make sure that your settings on here are different by right-clicking on your desktop for different tools. So we want a soft edge, and then we also want to lower the opacity of the erase, and I got it too strong in here, and what I can do is I can lighten this up slightly, and that looks a little bit better. It was a little strong up in that area, too much around the head, and maybe a little bit too much there too. Okay, so that looks a lot better. And then let's name it Duck 1 Shadow, and then we'll go on to part 2 on this, but a kind of a review of what we've done so far. We have added shadows, reviewed the lighting, or evaluated the lighting on the background and the rubber ducky, and we've added shadows to this, and lightened areas using the paintbrush up here, and used the command or the right click to size adjust either the soft edge or hard edge brush. We can go back to the eraser and use the eraser, setting the settings at the top and the options, and the same thing for the brush, setting these options. When you're using the paintbrush, do not forget that to set these back, because when you go to something else and you expect it to work at 100%, it'll be set at 12 because it keeps those settings set in your options. So don't forget that, and look for part 4 of the Introduction to Photoshop tutorials coming up next.